Before creating a migration plan and kicking off migration jobs, there are several things to set up so that they're in place when you go into the migration plan wizard. One of those things is called a migration policy. Migration policies can be found in Fly over on the left-hand side under Migration Settings to Migration Policy. A migration policy contains additional settings beyond just things like source to destination mappings that you'll need to ensure that your migration goes off the way that you want. Every type of migration has its own default migration policy, and you can also create additional ones with your own custom settings. To create a migration policy for a GDrive to Microsoft OneDrive migration, in Migration Policy, make sure Google Drive is selected up at the top, and then click Create. In the Create box, first give the migration policy a name and optional description. Below that, you'll see various settings, starting off first with how conflict resolution is handled. You have container level and content level. This is going to be if you migrate a container to an equivalent container level. So for instance, a folder to another folder. What happens if you are migrating a folder into OneDrive to a location that has a folder with an exact name? Do you want it to skip the migration, or do you want it to merge that folder's contents together with the destination folder? Same thing goes for content. You have skip, and in this case, instead of merge, we have overwrite by last modified, which will determine between source and destination which file is more recent and keep that, or append, which means you'll keep both files, and one of them will have a little number 1 at the end so you can tell that it was the one migrated in. Below conflict resolution, we have filter and mappings. First, the filter policy. If you have not created a filter policy, you'll see none in the dropdown, but you can create one at this time by clicking New. A filter policy's job is to determine which folders and/or files to bring in from the source and which to ignore. The filters are inclusive, which means if you activate that level of filter, folder, file, or both, and then configure its settings, only content matching that result will be included in the migration. So as an example here, for folder, I've set up created time within 3 years. That means if I try to migrate a folder as part of my plan that was created more than 3 years ago from the current system date, that folder will not be migrated. Again, these are inclusive. The same thing could go at the file level. In this example, we would only migrate docx files and nothing else. So be very careful with your filter policies. They can be extremely useful in making sure that you only migrate what you want, but accidental misconfiguration means you will not migrate content that you are looking for. Below filter policies, we then have user mapping. Again, if you haven't previously created one, it will say none, but you can click New. Just like with filter policies, you'd want to give it a name and then configure below that. You can map domains, so if you are switching from a previous domain into a new Office 365 named domain, you'd be able to put in the source and the destination to show it how to actually map that property. You can also do user mappings, and user mappings allow you to map source users to destination users. So as an example, in a source, if the owner was listed as Ron Delaney, but in the destination you don't want that name, you would be able to put in the destination user and it would change those values automatically as part of the migration. You can add more than one of those by clicking the Add button up here at the top and then building them in. The next choice to make is the property that's used to actually map the users. Do you want to use the principal name as it shows up in the original system, or would you prefer to use the display name instead? You'll notice you can also rearrange these if you wanted to give priority. So in case you needed to use both, for instance, in case there's a tie at that first level, you could then tell it, all right, after you check that, go down and check this to make sure that you have the correct things mapped to each other. Permission mapping, property mapping, and illegal character mapping. Under permission mappings, you'll see there is a default permission mapping, but if I view it, I can see how it's going to map my Google Drive permissions into my SharePoint permissions. This goes back to what I said near the beginning of the video on how each of your different migration sources requires its own separate migration policies. That's because if I was, for instance, doing a permission mapping for something like Exchange, well, these are not going to look the same. Now you cannot edit the default mappings, so if I want to, I can come in here and click on New, and I could change how these mappings actually work. You can see it's GDrive permissions mapped directly to appropriate SharePoint permissions. Same thing is going to go for property mappings. GDrive properties mapped over to SharePoint properties. So for instance, owner in GDrive, created by in SharePoint. If you would like, you can even remove a particular property so that it is not part of your migration. That will leave the default SharePoint property in place based on where that content is landing. And of course, when we're talking about OneDrive migrations, it's the same as SharePoint, which is why all these screens say SharePoint. Finally, illegal character mapping. The characters that could potentially be available in GDrive files that SharePoint would natively reject, you can see it wants to replace those with underscores to be sure that SharePoint does not run into any problems, both recognizing and then providing the files when users click on them. So all of these mappings should be thought through and spend some time building them out as necessary as part of this policy. So again, once you get over to creating the migration, you will just pick the migration policy of choice from the dropdown. A few additional ones down towards the bottom, including things like migrate the permissions of the source folder. This will break inheritance in SharePoint in OneDrive. Once the content comes in, it will examine all of the original permissions in GDrive and try to map to as closely as possible, regardless of what the destination permissions are. And it does that by breaking inheritance and then assigning those permissions directly. Same thing is going to go for source files. How do you want to display things that have been shared with that user when migrated? And would you like to collapse the folder structure? Essentially meaning if you have 3 levels of subfolders in GDrive, remove all those subfolder levels and just have a single folder of items. Once you have this entire policy set up the way that you want, you could click Save. It now appears here for you in this list, and now it is ready so that when you go into migration and create a GDrive to OneDrive migration plan, you will be able to select that migration policy and apply all of those settings. Thank you for watching this short video on creating a GDrive to OneDrive migration policy in Fly.